Hi everyone, it's week 9 of drawing requests and today's random comment is from Kai Nepthalem and he suggested a witch with a humanoid rabbit companion who is dressed like a superhero fighting an evil snail monster. Kai always produces really detailed and brilliant pieces of art, so go check him out, link should be on the screen somewhere. And like his work, this prompt has a lot of details, so it's going to be interesting to see which art style is going to be put to the challenge of this prompt. And the random art movement for today is Pre-Raphaelite. Dear God. Oh, I question putting this on the list. Okay, I'm going to manage some expectations right now. This style is about being perfect, it's very detailed and beautiful, and I'm not really at a level to mimic it properly, but maybe I can learn something from it, so I'll give it a go. Now, Pre-Raphaelite comes from the name of a group of artists who were known as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Pre-Raphaelite is a nod to Raphael, not the Ninja Turtle, but the artist the Ninja Turtle was named after. And it isn't a kind, loving nod, it's another, oh my god, why did you mess up art? I don't like it now and I want to make it better kind of scenarios that we just keep constantly coming across in these art videos. Which I think makes sense really. You reach your teenage years, your early 20s, and you want to reject everything that came before and recreate it in a way that closer reflects your own ideals. It's like that saying, if you're not a liberal when you're young, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative when you're old, you have no brain. I mean, I'm not really a big fan of that saying, but I would say that when you're young, you're far more open and willing to change your views than you are when you get older. And that's kind of what keeps things going and moving along, so there's nothing wrong with it really. And on that, the Pre-Raphaelites believed that the classical poses and compositions that artists like Raphael and the Mannerists implemented in their art, and that were lauded at the time in the art schools as being the correct way to lay out a painting, were just too restrictive. They wanted their paintings to have lots of detail, some intense colours compared to the dull palettes that you see in Raphael, and have more bizarre and complicated compositions that you see in things like Italian Quattrocento art, a style that was started in the early Renaissance. And the reason those paintings were dull, by the way, is because they used to mix bitumen into their paint. Yeah, bitumen like you would see on a road. So to get brighter colours, the Pre-Raphaelites just used very thin glazes of their paint over white canvas instead, and that's why their pieces appear a lot brighter. Now, it wasn't a rejection of the purpose of art in any way, which is what we saw in cases like Art Nouveau. The Pre-Raphaelites still agreed with the common concepts of art at the time, such as history painting, which isn't painting scenes from history like it exactly sounds, but is painting a scene from a story or a narrative. It's like an illustration in many ways. And also mimesis, which, like many words today, I'm pretty sure I've mispronounced. It's a bit harder to define, but it's a more general Greek term, which in art relates to mimicking and imitating what is being portrayed. A realistic style is probably the easiest way to explain that. Honestly, the Pre-Raphaelites had more conflict of interest than conflict with past art styles. They wanted to get back to the spiritual aspect of medieval art. They were romanticists in many ways, but they also wanted to realistically portray nature. This led to the group splitting into two, the realists and the non-realists, and the non-realists in the end became the foundation for Impressionists. Now, the Pre-Raphaelites were major influences too. I could spend the rest of the video naming all these famous artists who were calling back to them as key inspiration, even from now, and I'd say that would make a lot of sense personally, because surely the most common things people draw and paint are natural objects and scenes from stories, and this style the Pre-Raphaelites created encapsulated both pretty succinctly. Though, if you disagree, I'd love to hear what you think are the most common subject matters for art. I can only really think of portraits outside of nature and stories. I mean, maybe landscapes too, but I just feel like nature and stories are still painted a lot today, whereas the other two seem a little bit more specialist. Like you will be an artist of that thing if that is what you paint. Again, you can see how this style bled into later art movements, but I've mentioned that so many times in the last few videos, and I know you're all intelligent enough to make those links yourself, so it just is an interesting another piece of the puzzle to put in there. What I really want to talk about more is the process of making this painting. Now, I thought for about 10 seconds about whether I could paint this idea in real life, before realising that I just had to do it digitally, as for one, don't have any canvases at the moment, but more importantly too, I knew that I could find far more cheats that would make this a lot easier if I did it digitally. When it came to the background, I knew I had to get it looking somewhat realistic, but painting ocean waves and clouds sounded like this long drawn out nightmare, so I used photos from Google and overlaid the layers over this rough shaded colour that I made where I wanted the background sections to be, and then I just played with the opacity of those layers. By doing that, I've got these textures as a base for me to add on and paint onto later that at least appear somewhat realistic. Now, by adding that rough gradient beneath those images, it gives you a quick idea of a background, so I would recommend, if you know that your viewer is not really going to be paying much attention to your background because you've made something very interesting in the foreground of your painting, that this might be a quick cheat that you could also use in your work. Now, I knew I'd struggle with the realism of the characters, so I decided to use the prompt's fantasy, almost comic book feel to it, and channel that more into the painting as a whole. This felt especially right with the whole focus on changing up composition that the Pre-Raphaelites had, and to take a more modern comic book setup of movement and composition and repurpose it for this piece just felt right. I also added a lot of highlights and brighter colours as I went along. I wanted to, again, retain that brightness and vibrance that the Pre-Raphaelites were interested in, and that was far easier to do digitally than it ever would have been to do in something like acrylic or oil paint, at least for me. And another point I just wanted to make on creating this was at the end the piece had a real flat appearance. Now you'd be right to argue that I go on too far by adding lots of depth than really sticking to the Pre-Raphaelite style, which is a little bit flat. But I really wanted the thumbnail image to have a stronger composition, so it just felt like the right thing to do at the time. And what I mean by thumbnail image is, when I noticed the image was looking flat, I just zoomed out really far away from this image, so far that it had no detail and I couldn't really tell what it was anymore, and just appeared like little blocks of colour. I then went to the Channels tab on Photoshop and cycled through it and turned it into a black and white image. This showed me how flat the image was because the darks and the lights could appear almost as one grey in those simpler shades except for a few simple areas. And by seeing that, I was able to know which areas needed to be darker in terms of colour and which needed to be lighter, without just being blinded by colour alone. Now, I've probably mentioned this 100 times now, but I struggle with colours, so my attitude to facing colour in a painting is the baptism of fire kind of method. I've been forcing myself to start with it and sort out these tones later rather than the reverse for a while now, which I'd say is probably the most natural, common approach to it, just to make me improve far quicker at being able to use colour in a piece, or at least I hope. To darken these colours, I created an overlay layer and I started painting in a dull, almost grey hue of the colours in the areas I wanted to shade. The only advice I could really give you is never paint with white or almost white paint on an overlay layer digitally unless you want it to glow. Keep colours dull, and then you can just add shading quickly without another hour of painting lots of layers of paint. Now, once I was happy with the shading, I was really tempted to add another texture over the top of this whole image just to give it an aged appearance, but I decided to add enough textures to be getting on with. This style is insane, and it really makes you consider the talent these painters had when you give the style a go yourself. I would say that I did shoot myself in the foot a bit. I didn't use a reference image for either the main character or the witch, and their cartooniness shows a lot, but at the same time, have you seen those paintings where people get those classic commercial paintings from thrift or charity stores and they paint over them in the same style but with, say, a giant Pikachu or a Gundam attacking the town or whatever it is in the image? It reminds me of that a bit, and I've always wanted to make one of those, so I was pretty happy with how it turned out. Plus, as always, it's amazing how much you can learn from parodying a style. It changes your approach and your way of thinking when it comes to drawing. They can really make it clearer to understand how you are naturally approaching things. So if you're looking for your own style, or you just can't see your style in the work you're producing, do some of this mimesis. Mimic another artist, throw yourself into their style, and it'll make you so much more aware of your own idiosyncrasies, and you'll just see how you are approaching compared to them, and you'll see it just from it being missing from the new style that you're trying out. This is a bit of a longer video to match up with this crazy long painting process. This took about 4 hours to complete, and I feel like it would have taken a minimum of 8 hours if I had done it on a canvas. I hope you're all doing well and enjoyed this week's drawing request. As always, if you have a suggestion for this week's video, leave a comment below, and it could get randomly chosen for next week and you'll get a little shout out too. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again soon.